Good evening and welcome in the name of Vienna University Library to today's event reclaiming the F word, Feminism and Modernity in 21st Century Anglophone African Women's Writing. My name is Birgit Athumani Hango. I'm the head of the African and Middle Eastern Studies Library, which is a specialized library within Vienna University Library. This event today is part of Erlesenes Erforschen series of Vienna University Library. Erlesenes Erforschen was initiated in 2018 to celebrate the 20th year anniversary of Uni Wien campus. Campus is an important place for the University of Vienna and the University Library. 11 of our specialized libraries are located here. Colleagues have been organizing exhibitions and book presentations for many years here already. Erlesenes Erforschen opens up the opportunity to present the Vienna University Library even more clearly as an interface between academia and the public. With events like this, scientific research and publications are placed in a social context and are made accessible to a larger audience. I would like to thank the team Public Relations of the Vienna University Library for making this event possible. Thanks a lot for working so hard on Erlesenes Erforschen. We are here today to hear more about Dobrota Pucherova's book, Reclaiming the F Word, and I would like to introduce Dobrota now in a few words. Dobrota Pucherova studied English literature at Mount Holyoke College, USA, and at University of Oxford, where she defended her Doctor of Philosophy thesis on South African literature. She's a lecturer at the Department of African Studies and the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Vienna, but she's as well senior researcher at the Institute of World Literature at the Slovak Academy of Science in Bratislava. Her research and teaching interests are mainly in African Anglophone literature and Central European literatures, especially Slovak and Czech, especially in relation to theories of postcolonialism, feminism, postcommunism, transculturalism, and world literature. Today, she will present her latest monograph, titled Feminism and Modernity in Anglophone African Women's Writing, a 21st Century Global Context, published by Routledge last year. The book is available in print at the Specialized Library for African and Middle Eastern Studies, and as well as ebook. The author, Dobrota, will discuss her book today with Sarah Heinz. Unfortunately, she is ill, but we are very happy to see her via Zoom. So let me introduce her with a few words as well. Sarah Heinz is professor for Anglophone literature at the University of Vienna. Before coming to Austria, she taught at the universities of Passau, Mannheim, and at Humboldt University in Berlin, and was a visiting scholar at the University of Michigan and National University of Ireland in Galway. Ever since her PhD on postmodern identity in A.S. Bayard's novels, her research has been concerned with the contingent and shifting subject positions that the cultural context can offer and construct, and in the ways in which such identities are represented, contested, and developed by works of art. This impacts her research within critical whiteness studies and intersectionality, which she has explored in contexts ranging from Ireland and Britain to Australia and Nigeria. Most recently, she has focused on ideas and ideals of home and homemaking practices and is working on a project on the reassessment of home during lockdown in literary reworking of COVID-19. So I'm almost finished. A few comments on the event's process. During the discussion, you may ask questions via Slido, either directly below the streaming window or via smartphone. For the audience here, Please remember to switch your phones to silent mode. And of course, you can ask questions as well, but better after the discussion. Wine and open sandwiches are served next door at the end of the event. And now I would like to hand over to Dobrota and Sarah Heinz. I wish you an interesting and exciting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Birgit, for this introduction. I feel very privileged to present my book here at University of Vienna. And it is very fitting because this book wouldn't have been written without the excellent library resources here and without my teaching here, because it arises directly from my courses on African women's writing that are especially in demand by my students. In other words, this is not the book I was planning to write. My idea was to write a book about the debate on tradition versus modernity in contemporary African literature. But as I was researching in preparation for my courses, and Birgit was extremely helpful in ordering any new book I discovered, I realized that this debate has today been overtaken by women. And it is quite natural, since modernity is an issue that pertains to women most profoundly, because they were excluded from it for centuries. I also realized that I was witnessing a fundamental epistemic shift taking place in African feminism in the 21st century, from a culturally exclusive to a transcultural feminism that conceptualizes African femininity through the risky opening of oneself to otherness, transculturation, and translation. Writing this book was a journey of discovery that made me realize that Anglo-African women's texts could be very productively be read alongside English women writers cross-culturally and transhistorically. In other words, rather than looking at how African women have been writing back to African male writers or to the empire, as post-colonial critics have done, by reading them alongside their Western counterparts, I was able to see patterns that make it possible to situate this writing as an integral part of women's literary history. Such a reading makes it possible to see that worldwide, patriarchy has invoked traditions to subjugate women, and women have responded to patriarchy by producing a feminist imagination that is not culturally specific, but intelligible cross-culturally, because it is inscribed directly on women's bodies. Such comparisons, of course, must pay attention to the different historical contexts of literary and print cultures. Otherwise, they would be anachronistic and unfair to African women. English women started writing and publishing in the 17th century, whereas African women in the 1960s. Also, I must differentiate between the very uneven literary cultures across Africa, because not everywhere women started writing in the 1960s. For example, Somali women only started writing in the 21st century, and outside of Somalia. In this comparative reading, for example, the contemporary phenomenon of the new South African woman can be related to the new woman movement of the late 19th century Euro-American feminism. Similarly, 21st century Somali women's memoirs about forced marriage and female genital mutilation can be productively compared to 18th century English Enlightenment narratives by women, just as recent African queer writing can be productively compared to the trope of androgyny that was an important feminist concept of English language literary modernism. Such a transcontinental and transhistorical feminist analysis enables a unique examination of the relationship between gender and modernity. In other words, I'm interested in how it is that certain ideas are to be found in literary texts by women on different continents, centuries apart. Finding out how makes it possible to understand patriarchy as an embodied rather than discursive experience, and feminism as women's universal response to the violation of their bodies. After this brief overview, I'm going to flesh out my argument a little bit more. My book is premised on the idea proposed by the Cameroonian scholar Juliana Makuchin-Fa Abeni that when African women started writing in the 1960s, they were in fact creating a coded feminist theory, or what she calls fictionalized theory, or theorized fiction. These African women started writing to correct male representations of African modernity, in which women are either invisible, sexually demonized, or nameless. And they asked whether African modernity was only for men. Their heroines live in colonial or neo-colonial societies, but the types of oppression that touch them most intimately do not come from the outside, but from the inside. They are traditional customs, such as the arranged marriage, the bride price, polygamy, the high value put on motherhood and on the birthing of sons, female genital cutting, socially sanctioned rape, women's inability to inherit property or obtained child custody, and so on. One of the most pervasive themes in these texts is romantic love, in which heroines choose romance over arranged marriage and polygamy. Other typical themes are the journey from the country to the city to escape domestic drudgery and the desire for education to achieve financial independence. Their desires for modern identities, however, typically end catastrophically as death, rape, suicide, or madness. Clearly, for this generation of African women writers, a happy end is impossible to imagine, because they were modern women in societies that were not yet modern. And it is not accidental that these novels mirror many 18th and 19th century European narratives whose heroines must die because their desires, or the desires of others towards them, threaten conventional morality. I am arguing that the feminist narrative by the first and second generation African women writers can be read in parallel to English women writers before the 20th century. Both proposed that for women to live their full potential, they must be treated as human beings endowed with reason. This ideology, which has been called first-wave feminism in the West, however, had its limits. It didn't, for example, demand full gender equality because it believed in the essential biological differences between men and women. It was also unable to imagine a woman's subjectivity as fully independent of a man. Also, it couldn't accept that a woman has unalienable rights over her body. This was somehow always overshadowed by the larger imperative of procreation. These limitations can be also seen in African feminist theory that started emerging in the 1980s as a response to Western second-wave feminism, which was seen by African women as an ideology of individualism, materialism, sexual hedonism, and militant gender separatism. Its focus on sexual liberation was deeply incomprehensible to these African women for whom marriage and motherhood were the way a woman gains social status. And also, for them, neo-colonialism seemed a much more urgent issue than sexism. And to indicate their difference from Western women, African women called their theories womanism, motherism, Stevenism, nego-feminism, or a feminism with a small f. These discourses must be understood as a political reaction to the limitations of Western feminism, which historically overlooked the roles of racism and imperialism in the subjugation of African women. And simultaneously, as a legitimate need to define their own terms of the feminist struggle. However, these African feminisms also had their limits and blind spots, as contemporary African feminists have pointed out. In their focus on African women's neo-colonial oppression, they underplayed gender oppression because they sought coalition with African men. Emphasizing negotiation and compromise, these Afrocentric feminists went only halfway, just like first-wave feminism in the West. They argued that they didn't want to change society. Women only wanted a little bit more space. Moreover, it defined itself problematically through traditions that are harmful to women, such as the social obligation of motherhood. All of this radically changes in the 21st century. I am arguing in my book that what we are witnessing in the last 23 years is a paradigmatic shift in African feminism that can be compared to the second wave Western feminism. So what has changed? First of all, 21st century African feminism has become unapologetically radical, and it is not afraid to say so. Instead of negotiation and compromise, it is not afraid to blow apart patriarchy, and it views this as necessary. Secondly, it sees patriarchy as not just a cultural, but a political phenomenon that threatens democracy. Gender inequality is seen as a key issue, not a secondary problem. While women may be oppressed by dictatorship, corruption, neo-colonialism, racism, religious fundamentalism, or war, gender is a cross-cutting issue through which all other types of oppression should be viewed. Thirdly, this new African feminism rejects traditional gender roles and focuses on the female body as the crucial site of women's oppression as well as their freedom. Sexuality, once considered a Western feminist concern, is brought center stage and recognized as the site on which the struggles for power in Africa have been staged. Through practices to discipline and control women's bodies that were previously seen as untouchable cultural traditions. Sexual pleasure is seen in this writing as a feminist choice that can be part of reclaiming women's agency, power, and human rights. Women's rights to their bodies are recognized as their universal human rights. This is predicated on the idea that human rights must be universal, not culturally relative, because cultural norms and practices were designed by men with the objective of subjugating women, as Ugandan feminist Sylvia Tamala has pointed out. This also means that individualism is recognized by the new African feminism as necessary for conceptualizing individual human rights, and not anymore a Western ideology of self-centered egoism. Fourthly, African women today see feminism as a global movement. This perspective has been enabled by intensified globalization, increased migration, and digitalization, but also by a greater inclusivity of Western feminism. This global consciousness allows them to claim predecessors worldwide, appropriating a history of feminist resistance as a common heritage. Significant themes in contemporary African women's writing are nomadism, border crossings, displacement, unhomeliness, and exploration of otherness. For this new empowered generation of African feminists, the African versus Western feminism is no longer the analytical frame of feminist inquiry. And they indicate this by explicitly embracing the term feminism, as, for example, in the title of the journal Feminist Africa, launched in 2000, or in the Charter of Feminist Principles for African Feminists from 2006, which states, We define and name ourselves publicly as feminists, and note the capital F, which is a direct response to Emecheta's feminism with a small f, because we celebrate our feminist identities and politics. We recognize that the work of fighting for women's rights is deeply political, and the process of naming is political too. Choosing to name ourselves feminist places us in a clear ideological position. By naming ourselves as feminists, we politicize the struggle for women's rights. Our feminist identity is not qualified with ifs, buts, or however. We are feminists, full stop. Also, the Ugandan feminist Sylvia Tamale, from whom the title of my lecture is borrowed, wrote in 2006 that for various reasons, African women have been avoiding the F word, feminism. However, she says that the term needs to be reclaimed because it has political power, and she calls it a feminism with a capital F. So, how is this new feminism reflected in African women's narratives? For example, we now have happy endings. But that doesn't necessarily mean marriage. These female protagonists typically do not aspire to marriage or motherhood, or if they do, they are not willing to sacrifice everything for it. They have independent incomes and aspirations, commitment-free sexual relationships, children outside marriage. They have lesbian lovers, and they assert their right to sexual pleasure, even outside procreative sex. Or they reject female gender identity altogether. And they are able to do this without paying for it with death or madness, because modernity is no longer perceived as Western and tradition as African. The advantage of fiction is that it doesn't theorize, it performs its ideas. By depicting bodily pain as caused by patriarchy and pleasure as enabled by individual freedom, these narratives perform the meanings of these concepts that have been seen as Western. And they show that all women perceive pain and pleasure in the same way, regardless of their culture. And now I give you a very brief overview of my chapters. So in chapter 2, I compare the work of two expatriate Nigerians, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and Sefi Atta, to argue that the idea of Afropolitanism as a consciousness of being part of the world has a unique potential for advancing African feminism because it enables a transcultural positionality that can critique African gender politics and makes it possible to imagine an alternative gender order. In chapter 3, I analyze the discursive censorship and auto-censorship of Ugandan women's writing since their entry into literary publishing in the 1990s. And I compare their experience with that of 19th century English women writers. The diasporic generation of Ugandan women is seen to free itself from this discursive censorship and create narratives that are entirely woman-centered. In chapter 4, I read the representation of female genital mutilation in 3 East African texts alongside 18th century English proto-feminist texts to show that this practice is part of universal systemic sexism that casts women as irrational. Enlightenment ideas of selfhood are shown as an opportunity for African women to reconstruct themselves as free, rational, and sovereign subjects with unalienable rights to their bodies. In chapter 5, I analyzed 3 South African novels in the context of the post-apartheid debates on toxic masculinities, nationalism, and the new South African woman, which I read in analogy to the new woman in first wave Western feminism. In chapter 6, I analyze sexual desire between women in fiction and memoir from Nigeria, Uganda, Botswana, and South Africa as an expression of women's right to self-determination outside heterosexuality, but also as an imagination of a democratic society that respects otherness. By insisting that women's bodies are meaningful in themselves, these texts draw a direct relationship between women's sexual pleasure, freedom, power, and agency. And finally, in chapter 7, I analyze African transgender texts from Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa as an explicit articulation of 21st century African feminism. That the meaning of the body is not fixed, but it's fluid, and it is generated by a person's lived experience. And that it is imperative to redefine African femininity so that African women no longer feel a deep dissonance between their sex, their sexuality, and their assigned gender. So that's my introduction. Thank you very much. And I'm now going to turn to Sarah Hines. Sarah, can we see each other?
Yes, I see you. Thank you, Dobrota, for that introduction to your book. It's a pity I can't be with you, but I guess I'm also a bit infectious, so all the better for all of us. I would like to start with a question on your own positionality as a white European woman writing about African literatures. Because among researchers, there have been very animated debates about issues of appropriation in this context. So how would you say you see your role as both a researcher of world literature and of African literatures in that context?
Yes, thank you for this question. When it became clear to me that my book was going to be about African feminism, of course, I asked myself, am I allowed as a white European woman to write about African feminism? Because this is not my experience, and because of the history of European colonialism in Africa, and also because of the uneven publishing opportunities for Africans versus Europeans that we are often discussing. And I think these questions are very important to ask because, as we all know from post-colonialism and feminism, knowledge is never objective. It is always situated. So we have to be profoundly aware of our positionality. At the same time, I think this question can take us to shaky grounds, because then we also have to ask questions such as, is a German scholar allowed to write about Central European Holocaust memoirs? Or is a Russian writer or Russian scholar allowed to write about Ukrainian literature? Is a straight scholar allowed to write about gay writing? Or is somebody who has never experienced communist dictatorship allowed to write about it? And I think the answer is yes, but we have to be profoundly aware of our positionality, and we have to inform ourselves about the various nuances of the foreign culture that we are studying. And for me, one of the sort of points of access, or one of the points where I felt I could relate to post-colonial African feminism, was because I also come from a culture that where feminism has been seen as a foreign concept, and there was a lot of resistance to it. Slovak feminism starts in the last quarter of the 19th century, and it was very much inspired by Western, especially American feminism. It was completely rejected by Slovak nationalists who who said these ideas come from abroad, they are not our ideas, they are foreign concepts, and right now we have to focus on our own national liberation, because Slovakia at the time was under the double domination of Austria-Hungary. So the nationalist discourses are always very threatened by feminist ideas because they want the women to be at home and to embrace traditional identities. So I think yes, we always have to approach our subject of study with profound respect. And I have one more anecdote about it. Recently, I was given the opportunity to write the afterword for the Slovak translation of Chinelo Okperanta's novel Under the Udala Trees. And so I wrote the afterword in Slovak, and then there was a message from Chinelo Okperanta's agent who said, the author would like to read this afterword. And I thought, well, of course, she wants to read it because this is the first African lesbian novel, and she wants to make sure that she's not misinterpreted. So I translated myself back into English, and I sent the afterword. And Chinelo Okperanta responded that she was very happy with this afterword. So when I get this kind of feedback, I feel that maybe I'm not completely misreading this literature.
Yeah, thank you. In your book, you note that the novel as a genre has been specifically attractive to African women writers due to what you call the novel's boundless formal flexibility. And this has also been the case with European women writers that you look at. And you nicely outline that this flexibility, the novel has also sometimes been called a baggy monster because you can pretty much do anything with it. That this flexibility allows for female points of view that create narrative agency. And you have also noted that literary text does creatively perform ideas of women's rights, the body, or sexual relations. If you think about specifically the novels in your corpus, how would you say the texts that you analyzed experiment and work with the novel and its flexibility? And are there any specific forms of using the novel that struck you as most powerful?
Yes. The novel is a great genre because really you can do whatever you want with it. You can write it in the form of dialogues, as a confession, as dreams, as letters, as history, as the rambling of a madman. And the novel's flexibility has greatly been exploited by African women writers to express themselves. One of the earliest novels by an African woman is Efuru by Flora Nwapa, a Nigerian writer, published in 1966, which is almost entirely written in the form of a dialogue and gossip between women. And this is a form that Flora Nwapa appropriates from traditional Igbo storytelling, but it is also a form that allows her to give these women a voice. So instead of an omniscient third-person narrator, she gives these women the opportunity to comment on what is going on. And in this way, she shows that the meaning of anything really depends on by whom it is told. African women in the 21st century have invented a lot of new genres that didn't exist before. We now have African chick lit, we have the Afropolitan novel, we have the African lesbian novel, we have the African transgender novel, and African women are also appropriating genres that were previously the domain of men, such as the crime novel, the science fiction novel, magical realism, and notably the historical novel, which has been completely overtaken by African women. and they are using it to revise African histories from a female perspective. The most experimental novel that I have come across in my research for this book is this one, and I've brought it to show you. Freshwater by Nigerian transgender writer Akwaeke Emezi, which has a protagonist that can be seen as transgender. So Ada is born as a woman, but she has something like a multiplicity and identity disorder. There are three voices in her head battling for control over her mind. And these are three ancestral spirits. So the novel is very much inspired by Igbo mythology, and the narrative is very strange because sometimes the narrator speaks from a third-person plural perspective, we, these three spirits in her head. Sometimes it's a third-person narrative, sometimes it's focalized through the first person. That's when Ada feels like she's very stable. And also, there's a lot of stream of consciousness, gaps and absences, circular narration. This is a story that is constantly invoking ancestral spirits, and it considers contact with ancestral spirits to be a normal thing of everyday life. Another novel that is very interesting as well, even though it's not so formally experimental, is the novel First Woman by Ugandan writer Jennifer Makumbi. And I've singled it out because this is a very postmodern reinvention of African feminism. So Jennifer Makumbi was very frustrated by the fact that Ugandans were saying feminism is not part of our culture. It is a Western thing. Yet, she says, and I have a quote, I quote her in my book. She says, I grew up with women who, when I look back at it, I would say were feminists, but they would never ever describe themselves so. But their actions, they were completely feminist. And she says, I wanted to show this, that our culture actually has feminism in it. And she says, I wanted to show that we had feminist thought before the Western feminism came. If you think Western feminism is wrong, then okay, let's get rid of it. But let's look at what we have here. And in the end, you're going to find that they intersect. So in this book, she is drawing from Luganda culture. For example, she's referring to traditional practices that were used to enhance women's sexual pleasure, and she creates this character, a girl in a boarding school called Kana, who is this representative of this female power, of this female sexual power. And she's very proud of her mighty vagina. And Makumbi actually gives a name to this Luganda feminism. I'm not sure I can pronounce it. She says it's Mwen Kanon Kano. So this is the Luganda feminism. Of course, it's a word she has invented, but for her, it's a sort of postmodern reinvention of traditional feminism. And I think this is extremely interesting, that she's creating an African feminism, but she's not putting it in opposition to Western feminism. She's saying, in the end, you're going to find that they intersect.
Yeah, interesting. Did you find it difficult to pick your corpus, given the richness and variety of African women's writing?
Yes, I did. So yeah, there were many things I had to leave out. So I was trying maybe to pick those novels that were less written about by other scholars, maybe. And I was really aiming at the most recent, the newest books. So this book, for example, was published in 2020.
Yeah. You have already talked about the role of allegedly masculine genres like crime fiction, and in your chapter on
Yeah.
the new South African woman, you specifically delve into that issue. Now, how do the writers, specifically in South Africa, use such genres like crime fiction, and is that use connected to the construction of what you describe as a new South African woman's identity? That reuse and adaptation of allegedly masculine genres.
Yes, crime fiction is a typically masculine genre because it's been traditionally written by men. Typically, the detective is a man and the victim is a woman. Also, crime fiction typically tries to re-establish a patriarchal middle-class order. In this sense, it's very interesting that somebody like Angela Makolva in South Africa has reappropriated detective fiction, and she's writing it from a feminist perspective. She has female detectives, and the detective figure in particular is very interesting because she represents the new South African woman, this aspirational role model for South African women that has been very pervasive in South African popular culture, media, and literature. So the new South African woman is a very independent woman who has a career. She's highly educated. She is very modern. She always wears the latest fashion. She always wears the perfect makeup. She drives a car. She has disposable income, so she can spend it on herself. And she's very ambitious and driven. And also her desires in life are pleasure, travel, and conspicuous consumption. Not so much marriage and family, that she keeps as an afterthought. And to us in the West, maybe this kind of role model can seem a little bit superficial because it looks like these women somehow are trapped by these ideals of beauty, these male or patriarchal standards of beauty that are very impossible to reach. And these women are constantly thinking about how to lose weight and how to look great. And also they think that happiness can be reached by buying things, by having the latest Gucci bag and so on. Second wave Western feminism was all about throwing this all away. Stop shaving your legs, stop shaving your underarms, put on dirty jeans and leave your hair greasy. Nevertheless, I think we have to look at the new South African woman in a local perspective. This is a country where until 1990, a black woman was not even allowed to live in the city unless she worked as a nanny or a servant for white people. She was very poor. She couldn't enter a shop or a restaurant. She was probably barefoot. She was most likely illiterate. And in this sense, this kind of role model is extremely empowering for the black South African woman because suddenly she has money to buy herself things.
In research on these kinds of texts, you note that there has been comments on the kind of middle class bias of these texts, and that the new South African woman might be a generalization that does not cover the realities of all South African women. How do you position your readings of these texts within that debate?
Yes. Yes, I also, of course, look at these blind spots in this writing. Many of these heroines are middle class, and they achieve their independence by displacing their domestic labor on the domestic servant, and this is of course problematic. So yes, the class consciousness varies in these works. Some African women writers are profoundly class conscious, for example, Sefi Atta. Others really just focus on the middle class emancipated heroine. South African critic Linda Spencer has argued that we shouldn't really criticize it so much, because for these women, this kind of conspicuous consumption and traveling and having these new opportunities is a completely new situation, and it can be a situation from which it is possible to fashion new feminist identities. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I see. So a kind of empowering appropriation of consumption rather than a negation of feminist concerns. I mean, there is this whole debate about post-feminism, and the damaging impact that post-feminism has had on the feminist movement, saying, we have reached all this, let's just go and buy shoes. So in that sense, it's really interesting that the same topics are used for very different effect in these texts then. Yeah. Now, one key theme that I found especially interesting due to my own research interests is unhomeliness and displacement. And this is very interesting because Western feminists have seen home as a place of oppression, unpaid labor, or even a site of threat, for example, when it comes to domestic violence. However, there has been, since the 1980s, there has been this debate of, Black women writers writing back to that deconstruction of home. For example, with Bell Hooks and her emphasis that home was a site of empowerment and dignity for Black people in the US. Now, how does home feature in your writers' works, and what are the imaginaries tied to home in the text that you have looked at?
Yes, I think home and homelessness are really central concepts in women's writing transculturally and transhistorically. And that's because women are not supposed to feel at home where they are at home, because they are meant to be married off and leave home and start a new home somewhere else. And also, they are not supposed to inherit their family home. This goes to their brothers, of course, and this is a big theme, for example, in Jane Austen's novels. Women also typically do not feel at home in their nation, in their country, because they are second-class citizens. And this is why, famously, Virginia Woolf wrote, "As a woman, I have no nation. As a woman, I want no nation. As a woman, my country," or maybe she said country. "As a woman, I want no country. My country is the whole world." And this is why transnational feminism is so important for women. In the novels and works that I am analyzing in my book, the most typical narrative is about a woman who is leaving home. She's leaving her country because she's unable to realize her full potential in this country. Also, maybe she's leaving her country because she's running away from forced marriage, or from female genital mutilation, or from homophobia. And this woman, this female protagonist, is typically leaving for the West. Some critics, some Western critics, have argued that this is very problematic, that these narratives seem to suggest that the woman can only achieve freedom and happiness in the West. And yes, it is problematic. At the same time, I think that these narratives of migration open up a transcultural positionality for these women that gives them the opportunity to see their own culture from the outside and to criticize it, to imagine an alternative gender order, and to reimagine their own femininity. It also eventually makes it possible for them to change the gender order in their society, because many of these women have become activists who are traveling back to their own countries and trying to change the culture and the patriarchal order. This is, in my book, I also comment on the fact that this can also be very interestingly compared to Eastern European women's writing after the fall of communism, because also typically these are narratives in which a woman leaves her home and she travels to the West, very often to the United States, you know, the imagined country of freedom. And that's because these women are very disappointed with post-communist masculinity, which they see as impotent, symbolically impotent, because for a very long time these men were unable to assert their dignity, they were denied their autonomy, their freedom, and they are only kind of slowly recovering from those years of communist oppression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this mapping of home and homeland is also so interesting because that has very often been seen as gendered in figures like, you know, Mother Ireland, Mother Africa, Mother India, and these are always women as mothers. Do you see that there is also political statement about African women rejecting to be metaphorized as Mother Africa? Is home and leaving home as leaving your country, is that politicized as a statement about I'm not Mother Africa, I'm just an African woman?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I should say that the rejection of the Mother Africa trope is already a big thing in the first and second generation African women's writing. That's why they started writing. They even say it explicitly in their interviews, you know. We don't want to be seen as Mother Africa. We are real women. So this was said, for example, by Flora Nwapa, Maria Maba, and so on. Yes, yes, it is definitely a political statement. I think in general, this generation of African women writers is disappointed with the direction of the African post-colony. And they no longer see themselves perhaps as writers for their nation, because they feel they are second-class citizens. So they see themselves as individual women writing, and they want to pursue their freedom and their happiness wherever. It doesn't have to be in Africa.
Yeah. So connected to this idea of home and also specifically to motherhood is a topic of orphans and homelessness. Do you see patterns in your texts as to where orphans make an appearance? And what would you say is the function of this figure in your author's texts? Because it's interestingly connected to this whole issue of leaving home, being motherless, being parentless, and also a kind of a lack of parent figures for those deemed orphans.
Yes, this is very interesting because after I wrote my book and I reread it after myself, I realized something I didn't notice before, which is that most of the female protagonists in these works that I'm analyzing are orphans, they are motherless, either symbolically or in fact. They do not have a mother because their mother is either dead, or she's unknown, or she has abandoned them, or she's very cruel. She has betrayed her daughter. The most obvious example is from the Somali women's memoirs, in which the mother betrays her daughter by arranging her female genital mutilation. But there are many other examples. For example, in South African novel Period Pain by Kopano Matlwa, there is a protagonist who experiences profound pain while menstruating. And the doctors tell her that the only way to get rid of it is by having her uterus taken out. So she wants to undergo this operation. And her mother says, "Are you crazy? Your role as a woman is to have children and have a family." Or in Sefi Atta's novel, A Bit of Difference, there is a little girl who says, "When I grow up, I want to be the president." And her mother says, "No, you're not going to be the president. Women do not become presidents." I was wondering, why is it that in none of these texts we have a genuinely supportive, caring mother? And I realized, in retrospect, that this is because being motherless, or symbolically motherless, makes it possible for these women to separate themselves from their culture and embark on a journey of self-discovery through the encounter of various surrogate mothers or cultural others who show them the way, who show them how it's possible to be a woman differently than her culture has told her. So, for example, in the memoir by Unoma Azua, there is an American lesbian woman that she meets, and when she meets her, she immediately understands that I'm like her. I want to be like her. Also, for example, in Freshwater, the novel I have already mentioned, Ada is motherless because her mother has abandoned her, but she seeks a spiritual connection with her ancestral mother, which is represented as a python in the story, because python is the sacred animal in Igbo culture. So in this way, these women are able to reinvent themselves, and it can be a very risky process, of course, because they have to abandon their own identity and open themselves unconditionally to the otherness of this stranger. It doesn't have to be a complete stranger. For example, in Makumbi's novel, the surrogate mother is a blind village witch who tells the protagonist how to be a woman. The condition of being an orphan is again a topic which is a very transhistoric and transcultural topic in women's writing. American critics Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar have written that orphanhood is a symbolic condition for the 19th century English heroine. And they have analyzed Jane Eyre as a paradigmatic example. But when you think about it, there are so many others. Dorothea Brooke in George Eliot's Middlemarch is an orphan. Fanny Price in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park is a symbolic orphan because her parents cannot look after her. And I can think of an example from my own culture. The first novel by a Slovak woman was published in 1889, and it's actually called The Orphan. And it's again a story about an orphan girl who is looking for the right man so that she can reintegrate herself into society. So I think this shows that feminist imagination, that there has been a very similar feminist imagination across cultures and centuries, and that perhaps women's experiences have been more similar than they have been different.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Let's turn to the key theme in your book, which is the body and African women's relations to their bodies, both in pain and pleasure. What are the different forms in which the body features in the text you look at? So how is the body performed in the literary text that you looked at? And do you see any patterns in these literary representations? Are there similar strategies that these women writers use to represent the body and women's relations to their own bodies?
Yes, the body is absolutely central to contemporary African women's writing. This was already said by previous critics in different ways. African women are reclaiming their body. They are saying that my body is my own, and they are refusing to subject themselves to unnecessary pain, and they are claiming their right to sexual pleasure. They are doing this because they see that the body has been the key territory that needs liberation from patriarchal oppression, because it is through the body and through the control of female sexuality that men have tried to subjugate women. And I think this is really a cross-cultural notion. In African literature, this is very new. In 20th century, we do not see the body being in the center of the discourse. This is why the Nigerian scholar Erlesenes Erforschen has argued that the focus on the body signifies an ethical turn in African literature, because it shows that morality cannot be culturally specific, because moral decisions really have a life and death consequence. So he argues that we need a certain universal moral values against which the treatment of women everywhere can be measured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, we'll come back to this issue of universal human rights in a moment, but before we do that, I would like to talk about your final chapter, in which you turn to transgender writing. Now, you state that there are not many texts like the ones you discuss. And would you say that texts like Africa 1, 2, 3 or Freshwater imply that transgender identities are seen as metaphorical rather than a reality for the new African feminism?
Yes. So I have only found 2 transgender fictional texts from Africa, but I decided to make a chapter about it because I found it extremely significant, because I think these texts are really making explicit what African 21st century feminism has been consistently implying. That the meaning of the body is not fixed, but it's fluid, and it is generated by a person's lived experience, and that it is absolutely necessary to redefine femininity so that African women no longer feel this deep dissonance between their sex, sexuality, and their assigned gender. And it shows that the meaning of the body is really produced performatively. It is created through a person's lived experience, because the body constantly produces a series of effects that give meaning to a person's identity in the process. The Transgender writing is also significant because it embraces sexuality as an absolutely key aspect of human identity. And it proposes that the sexed body is a source of discourse. It signifies. This is very well performed in Akwaeke Emezi's Freshwater, where we have the character Ada, who very often loses her ability to speak because she has experienced trauma. For example, after she's raped, she stops speaking. So she can only express herself through her body. She shaves her hair, she waxes her eyebrows, she tattoos her skin with the images of the ancestral spirits that are shouting in her head. She cuts herself with a razor. Most drastically, she has her breasts cut off because she doesn't want to be female. And all of these I see as her expression of écriture féminine. This is an idea by Helen Sixu that that a woman should write with her body because her body signifies. Her body is a source of ideas. This is a very important feminist idea because in Western thought, we have always perceived the sexualized body as inferior to the mind. The mind was always superior. The sexualized body is there for reproducing. By making the body into a signifying subject, Akwaeke Emezi is putting it on the same level as the mind. And she's saying that the body is actually more than just flesh. The body signifies. And this is very important for women because traditionally women have been seen as just bodies. And that's why Simone de Beauvoir wrote that the woman is the second sex. She's the other because she's always seen by men as just sexual body. So does that make sense?
Absolutely.
This kind of overcoming of the physicality of the female body.
Yeah, but at the same time, taking that physicality into account, I find it really fascinating that ideas like the body as signifying and the body as being performed do not take away, do not simply reduce the kind of politicization of actual pain and pleasure in these texts, and that they kind of straddle the difficult tension between an assessment of the discursivity and of women's bodies, but at the same time, basically emphasizing that in spite of the body as a performance, at the same time, the body is what shapes our sense of self and our relationships with other bodies. My final question, because we still want to take answers from the audience, is the issue of universal human rights that you have already touched upon. Now, this is a key building block of your theoretical framework, this assessment of women's rights as universal human rights, and the emphasis on this by African feminists of the 21st century. And you also outline that there is a sense of universality to this claim among all women across the globe, so transnationally, but also transhistorically. Yet at the same time, and this is maybe a bit similar to our discussion of the body, difference and context are also taken into account. So many of the texts that you analyzed zoom in on very specific cultural, national, historical, and individual predicaments. So how do the writers that you have looked at unite this difficult binary of universality and difference, of specificity and universality?
Yes. So, as a trained post-colonialist, I was always told to be suspicious of any discourse of universality, because usually it's hiding something that's Western, a Western idea, which is masking itself under the cover of universal. And this is why, for some African politicians or scholars, the idea of the so-called universal human rights is a suspicious idea because it comes from the West, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed and discussed in 1948 in Paris, mainly by colonial powers, where only 3 independent African countries were present. So it has had a problematic history. What is interesting is that these African women are saying, and that's writers as well as scholars, that actually the idea of universal human rights is a good idea, because without it, women's rights in Africa would have been stolen by cultural relativists who would say, oh, but this custom is part of our culture, so we're going to keep it, and we're not going to change it just because of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that comes from Europe. And as Sylvia Tamale has pointed out, most traditional customs have been designed by men with the objective to subjugate the human rights of women. When we come to the discussion of women's human rights more specifically, it becomes more interesting because women's human rights have been discussed and drafted at various United Nations women's conferences since the 1970s, where African women themselves participated. So, for example, the very famous Convention on the Elimination of All Kinds of Discrimination Against Women was drafted and adopted by a United Nations conference in New York in 1979, where African women participated, and since then it was ratified by most African countries, and it has been used very successfully to repel many sexist laws and customs in these countries. These African women sometimes participated at these conferences even without permission from their governments. For example, in 1985, a delegation of Ugandan women participated at the Women's Rights Conference in Nairobi, a United Nations conference, even though even though the Ugandan government tried to stop them, because President Obote was afraid that these women were going to bring foreign feminist ideas into Uganda. And yes, after these women returned to Uganda, they were starting to implement these ideas to fight for women's rights, for women's representation in the government. This conference in Nairobi in 1985 is also often considered to be the beginning of transnational feminist movement. So I think this shows that women's human rights are not a Western thing, but that they have really been created with participation of various stakeholders. And of course, the United Declaration of Human Rights and its ideas such as dignity, equality, fairness, security of person come from the West. But history has shown that these ideas in themselves are not Western, that they are universal, that everybody wants freedom and dignity and security of person. And And I think, therefore, we shouldn't really see them as culturally relative concepts. And these women are certainly saying that they shouldn't be seen as just Western concepts, because they are showing in their novels that their presence or absence of these values manifests itself as concrete bodily pain or as concrete bodily pleasure. So they are values that human beings experience all in the same way.
Yeah. Okay, I guess we can take a few questions from the audience.
Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Dobrota, for your project. Thank you for the book and the presentation. I have comments and the question at the end. The first comment is about the title. You spoke about African Anglophone, but during the discussion, it was about Africa, Africa, Africa. If you could maybe just say something about that, because when you speak, for example, about the corpus, the question of transgender writing, the question of home and so on, the picture is it's a whole different story if you move, to Francophone speaking countries, to Lusophone, and Hispanophone. And I'm even happy that you mentioned, you spoke several times about the first woman, and with this idea of this notion of feminism in bracket, the word that she came up with, which again says that we have to keep interrogating this category. I'm glad that you also mentioned Titi Dangaremka. Only exactly a month ago, she was in Vienna, as you know, and we had this talk and this question of feminism to her again. She said this is a big question. She's tired of being defined as a feminist. They should look at her as a social agent, somebody who is, doing something for things to change, as simply as that. So again, these concepts being imported, and now how you applying them, contextualizing them, if you could maybe say a few words on that again. How do you really differentiate what it means depending on the context and depending on the body of work that you've studied? The question, Sarah Rance, you mentioned that at the beginning. I think that was her first question, positionality. I think this is as far as I'm concerned, this is one of the most important points. As long as we do research on Africa with Africans from European universities, this is a topic of social relevance. You've had the privilege to have access to all these books because we have a fantastic library. But now, who has access to your own final product? How do you make sure that the knowledge you have produced is also accessible to people in Uganda, in Kenya, and so on? Thank you.
Thank you, Remy, for your questions. I will start with the second one, maybe. I was given the option by Routledge to publish this book open access, but I didn't have funding for it. So I had to go with the traditional printed volume. It is a very, very important question, and I'm aware of it, that I don't know to what extent my book will be accessible in these African countries. I have no control, really, over the price of the book. It is the publisher who decides about it. This book is very expensive, even for people in Slovakia, for instance. So yes, I am very troubled by these questions about accessibility and about African scholars not having the same platforms to be heard as we have in the West. And yes, and one way, to go about it is to always try to include African scholars whenever we are publishing an edited volume, whenever we are editing a journal, and so on. Your first question is a very good question. My research is only about Anglophone African women's writing, and I am very open about that in my title and in my introduction. I don't work on Francophone or Lusophone African writing because I can't read it in the original. So yes, when I speak about these feminist discourses, I speak about these discourses in Anglophone African women's writing. And I absolutely agree that every African woman has a right to define her feminism as she wants. If she doesn't want to be called a feminist, then that's her absolute right. I wasn't leaving out Tsitsi Dangarembga from this book because she doesn't want to be called a feminist. That was not at all my direction. I simply focused on those African women's texts that struck me as perhaps most representative of this trend or of this new movement of feminism with a big F.
I mean, this is now in your defense. My suggestion would really be that we are living in a very privileged environment. And this is a plea for a place like the University of Vienna to make sure that once such a book is published, that at least you as a researcher, you have access to funds for at least one kind of giving back trip. You know, that one of these places, one of the two places, be it Uganda or Kenya, so that you can go there. What we are experiencing here, it should also take place where these ideas, came from. This will be my suggestion.
Okay, I take your suggestion.
Hello, thank you. We received one question via Slido, via the online platform. I'm just going back to it now, from somebody called Jana. Thank you for a great talk. I have two questions. Firstly, how, in your opinion, can new African literature shape traditional roles in womanhood that still exist in homelands such as the Republic of Congo?
I haven't studied the women's writing from the Congo, so I can't say, unfortunately. I haven't come across any works by Anglophone women writers from the Congo. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
And the second question is actually, I think it's already answered because it was also about the availability of the book, but more locally, as in it will be in bookstores or just online or in the library, obviously.
My book definitely will be marketed internationally, yes.
Okay.
Dobrota, thank you very much for your lovely talk. Speaking about markets, what roles does the American and English book market actually play in publishing these novels that you have analyzed? Are they first published locally and then in the American or English market if they are successful? Or is actually the American or English market the gateway for feminist writing?
Yes, as you have suggested, it is the other way around. Yes, most of these books are actually first published either in London or New York or somewhere in the West. And if they are successful in the West, then sometimes local publishers will take them on because they no longer see it as a publishing risk. And this is, of course, very unfortunate, and it is the consequence of literary cultures on the African continent and of poverty. Africans cannot afford to buy fiction books. So publishers are very careful about taking on fiction. The one exception would be South Africa, which has a very thriving literary market and fiction market. So yes, it is a very kind of strange situation which is governed really by the laws of the market, by this kind of idea also that value is somehow created in the West, you know, and once Africans see that a book has been valued and has received prizes in the West, then they also will want to have and publish this book, which is a very post-colonial situation and has been criticized very much by many, many critics. Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, one question. You talked about Zizi Dangaremba, who does not want to be called a feminist, as I heard. Are there any 20th century writers who later on embraced the term feminist, or was it just the new generation?
Yes, there were some African women from the first and second generation who originally didn't want to be called feminists, and then they reconsidered. For example, Flora Nwapa is one of them, who said in an interview that, you know, originally I didn't want to be associated with feminism, and always I said, please, please, I'm not a feminist. I'm just a woman writing about women. But when I understood that feminism is actually about women's dignity, and it's actually about women fighting for their rights, then I realized, yes, I want to be called a feminist. Yes, and these kind of stories are very interesting and very revealing, I think, because they show that ideas are not threatening in themselves. I think it all depends on how they are used and by whom, and that's exactly the same for the idea of human rights. Sarah, did you have another question that
I don't know whether we still have the time for another question. Do we?
Yes, we have a signal that we do. Yes.
All right. I mean, it probably ties in with some of the questions that have been asked. So there is this. What you also discuss in your book is the whole discussion surrounding the Enlightenment in your book. So the Enlightenment was deeply racist, and it problematically mapped reason onto whiteness and masculinity. However, you also show that it has been a major tool for women writers to claim dignity, agency, and human rights. How do African women writers, the Anglophone African women writers that you looked at, how do they position themselves towards the Enlightenment today? in the light of their reclaiming of the F word?
Yes. So the Enlightenment tradition, of course, has a very controversial history in Africa, because it is the source of the idea of modernity, which was used by colonialists to subjugate Africans under the pretext of educating them and civilizing them. Yet many of these African women are embracing ideas that have been created by the Enlightenment tradition, such as the rational subject, for example, or the sovereign self, the autonomous free subject. And they have been criticized for this by a number of Western critics who have pointed out that you are making a mistake. These ideas come from the Enlightenment tradition, which has been very racist and colonialist, and none of these Enlightenment thinkers that you admire, such as Immanuel Kant or John Stuart Mill, would have considered you as an African woman an equal to himself. Right? Enlightenment was a society built on slavery and colonialism. And also, these Western critics have pointed out that actually the idea of the rational subject, of the sovereign autonomous subject, is quite outdated, because according to postmodernism, the self is dispersed, and the subject is very unstable and irrational and fluid. And in particular, I'm speaking about Somali women writers whom I'm discussing in chapter 4, for whom these ideas have been really a very important instrument to empower themselves, because in their countries, they had never been considered to be rational subjects who had the freedom and agency to decide about their own lives and bodies. This is because Somalia, the situation of Somali women has been affected by both patriarchy as well as Islamic culture, as well as this belated literary culture in Somalia, which has been a mainly oral culture. So I think this shows really nicely how it's very easy for us in the West to deconstruct something that we already securely possess. But for African women who had never been considered modern subjects in their cultures, who were always considered minors, and the decisions about themselves were always made by men, whether it was a husband, a father, or even a son, these kind of ideas can actually be very empowering. So I'm saying that actually modernity can be a better idea for these women than postmodernity, because they have not yet been modern and they need to reclaim their modern, emancipated and free, autonomous subjectivity.
Yes, thank you.
Maybe I take the word again. So thank you very much, Dobrota, for presenting your book. And thank you, Sarah Heinz, for discussing. Thank you for the interesting evening. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And I may invite you now to wine and open sandwiches next door. So thank you for today. And goodbye, or let's go on discussing with wine and a little bit food. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.